I'm Cat Oriel, a breaking news reporter with Forbes. Today I'm joined with Congressman David Schweikert of Arizona. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. I think this is sort of our anniversary.
It is sort of our anniversary. As we've been talking about, we interviewed you almost more than a year ago for this channel, and a lot has changed since then. Most notably, the Republicans have taken back the House majority. But before I dive into my, more specific questions, I wanted to ask you more generally, what do you feel like is the biggest, most pressing issue and threat facing our country today? What is keeping you up at night?
The thing that's also impossible to talk about in many ways, it's our demographics. And it's a big word, but it's everything because it's the cascade of your ability to grow the economy. It's the ability to have innovation. It is the driver of almost 100% of the future debt, actually 100% of the future debt being healthcare costs, the collapse of the Social Security Trust Fund, those sorts of things. We in the industrialized West and the United States included have gotten much older. And yet it's almost the thing we're terrified to talk about.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not surprised immediately, you're talking about the debt. And what struck me the most when rewatching our previous interview was it almost felt like you were able to foreshadow the debt crisis that we just saw unfold. So is that a fair assumption or, fair
I'd
assessment?
love to sound like I was really, really smart and saw these things coming, but if someone actually just reads, um, and look, it's one of the reasons I respect what you do so much is you're one of the few outlets that's doing sort of adult conversation, adult interviews. Much of our information we either get through our phones or we see on cable news is whatever the outrageous shiny object is of the today. What can we be enraged at today? Yet every single second we borrow what $51,000 every second, and by the end of the decade we're close to 90,000 a second. It's that is the greatest threat to this republic, but it's also impossible to talk about because the vast majority of that growth and that borrowing, that spending, is healthcare costs.
And so, can you briefly bring me through, besides healthcare costs, what other factors do you think has led to our debt crisis? I mean, during our last interview, to quote you, you said regarding proposals from Democrats, they sound great, are good politics that might get you reelected, but it's crappy economics. So,
Oh yeah.
was it exclusively Joe Biden's policies regarding healthcare, regarding other things that led to the debt ceiling crisis? Bring me through what factors.
No. Look. The debt ceiling is just has been around for 100+ years. That's just the nature of it. What enraged me and really should have said anyone who actually owns a calculator was the lack of understanding of the mechanisms around it. Every time someone was saying we're going to default, okay, for those of us who actually showed up at our business classes, default is when you don't pay the interest on your bonds or don't pay off the bond when it's time. We were never going to default. Now that doesn't mean you didn't have a horrible stressor if 30% of every dollar a government spends is borrowed. That's a technical default. And it's almost like there was purposely this attempt to scare financial markets, though if you actually watched bond futures and those through this whole scenario, they stayed stable. Those in the futures market of sovereign debt, they're so much smarter than the rest of us. They didn't play the hysteria game. And why I'm annoyed with this is we still avoided the really difficult conversation of, okay, so we've now been able to squeeze down spending by a couple $1 trillion over 10 years, but it's coming from 11% of the budget, which is the non-defense discretionary. So you've taken it from spending $700 billion on government to $600 billion. Wonderful. But that's not where the growth in spending is. Over the decade, that non-discretionary was going to be pretty much flat. The incredible amount of spending growth and borrowing growth is our healthcare entitlements. It's Medicare. And we have a moral obligation to be able to keep that societal promise. But we are in such avoidance of the discussion of how to finance it, how to make it work, how to change the actual price of delivering that healthcare, that we had all this excitement, all this dancing, and never actually really talked about the problem.
Mm. So you feel like in the conversations that Speaker McCarthy and other top GOP negotiators, do you feel like they were able to get that message through to Democrats, or they were still dancing around the issues, the true issues as well in the negotiations?
I'm not being a jerk here. It's not that I feel, I can prove that there was no discussion about it, because my brothers and sisters on the left, there's this absolutely duplicitous thing going on here in Washington. Can you imagine that? Where I will have conversations with some of my Democrat colleagues when there's no camera around or reporter around, and they understand that they know it's immoral not being willing to talk about Social Security, and in less than 9 years, the trust fund is gone. Our brothers and sisters who are 65 and up take a 25% cut in their check, and therefore the United States will double senior poverty. That's immoral. And yet we had a president get up behind that podium during his State of the Union say, you're not allowed to talk about, and we're not going to touch Social Security. Okay. And we all applauded, but the cruelty of that is great politics. And in 9 years, we double senior poverty because of our unwillingness to tell the truth about the math. That's not feelings, it's math. And it also has this little ethical overtone. It's immoral what we're doing, but it's good politics.
Right. So going back to your conversations that you've had with people from the other side of the aisle, in our previous conversation, you kind of did mention or allude to a lack of bipartisanship, especially when when Congress was controlled by the Democrats, the White House was also controlled by the Democrats. There maybe was a lack of, from the other side, a lack of willingness to work and reach across the aisle. And do you feel like because the House is now controlled by the Republicans, there has been more bipartisanship and better relationships between Republicans and Democrats working together?
I think there's a more seriousness. The debt ceiling agreement, it was ultimately bipartisan. And it was because there was a serious approach to what's going on in the society, in our government. Unlike my brothers and sisters on the left, who just wanted to raise the debt ceiling and avoid the conversation. Much of my criticism before, when there was unified Democrat control, was the insatiable appetite to keep spending. This functionally lying to the American people, saying, well, if we just raise taxes on people over 400,000, we can finance things. And look, 400,000 and up in income is 2% of the population. We're not going to finance even a fraction of the debt, the borrowing, and the coming borrowing on that 2% of the population. It's sort of the political folklore so many people have run their campaigns on. And look, Republicans are sinners too. We often say, well, if we got rid of foreign aid or waste and fraud, every dime of foreign aid would cover about 12 days of borrowing. So yes, my answer is Republicans were completely frozen out in the previous couple of years. That's Democrat unified government. Now that we have divided government, if you're going to accomplish anything to the point where you get a signature on it, it requires you have to work with both sides. And that's one of the difficulties for everyone here, because we all got so used to sort of the posturing of no Republicans' ideas were going to pass, all Democrat ideas were going to pass. And now we're forced to actually talk to each other.
So that being said, what would you like to see the two sides work on together next?
Math.
what more generally about
Look, but I say that I'm dead serious. Remember your opening question, and I said demographics. The Social Security Trust Fund is not magically going to heal itself. The new projections, substantially because of inflation, and you know my feelings that much of inflation was 100% set off by a combination of monetary policy and Democrat spending. But healthcare inflation is 2.5 times faster than mean CPI. Meaning we're seeing some new calculations like Bloomberg Intelligence over the last week said by the end of the decade we're at 130% debt to GDP. If that math is accurate, that means over this 10 years we will borrow more than all the publicly held debt that exists today. That's coming off the rails. Even Moody's Analytics has us at 121% of debt to GDP 9 budget years from now. That's everything. That's what takes down republics. And yet we will sit here and do the shiny objects. And so you ask, what should we be doing with Democrats? Democrats own calculators. I don't know if there's batteries in them, but sorry, that was sarcastic. This is the thing that will ultimately crush the poor, crush the economy, and the ones who really get destroyed are people who are trying to survive their retirements, have retirement security, and younger populations who are going to pay just stunning amounts of taxes. And yet, how often is this part of your interviews, your conversations?
Well, switching topics now, another topic that I wanted to go back to is immigration. Of course, something that also affects the economy as well and is relevant for all Americans, and especially you in your state, Arizona, which is a physical border state. And something else that's changed in the last year since we spoke is the end of Title 42. And how have you felt? How do you feel about Republicans' actions on the border? Has it been helping, hurting Americans, taxpayers overall?
Look, there's this intense sense of frustration because we passed things. We passed actually a fairly substantial immigration bill, border security bill, and it will go nowhere in the Senate because of politics. When our Democrat colleagues are willing to admit that the last couple of years have been crushing to the working poor in America, it's a fascinating, and someone should actually do their PhD paper on this. 15 years ago, it was the left that advocated for border policies to not import huge waves of poverty because that crushed working people in America. And they used to accuse Republicans of wanting an open border for cheap labor. Something happened politically, particularly over the last decade, where that flipped. And there's some really interesting academic papers out there talk about one of the cruelest things you can do to the working poor in your country is import large numbers of other people who are with moderate skill sets. If you need to grow the economy, which we desperately do, you see our labor constraints we have. U.S. fertility rates are now hovering at 1.7. So in 18 years, the United States has more deaths than births. We actually have a fertility crisis and demographic issues. You would actually engage in what much of the rest of the industrialized world is doing, which is trying to steal each other's smart people. Whether that be a skilled carpenter or, a physicist. And that requires sort of an adult conversation of what's actually happening in the country demographically, labor supply. But the only way you're going to get to doing a pro-growth, pro-stability immigration piece of legislation is you got to lock down the chaos that is the border. And if you want to see the second degree, third degree effects of open border policies, come to my community, come to Phoenix, Arizona, where I can show you zip codes where the homelessness is doubled. Fentanyl is crashed in price and is everywhere. And parts of these are derivatives, whether you like it or not, of the current Democrats' border policy.
Yeah. Okay. So another topic that I know is very personal to you as well is Roe v. Wade. And so that is something that's also changed in the past year since we last spoke. Roe v. Wade has now been overturned by the Supreme Court. So can you talk a little bit about how the past year has felt to you, being pro-life, and just what that decision has meant? And do you support any future restrictions, more wide-reaching restrictions, such as a nationwide abortion ban?
Actually, okay, this is personal. Matter of fact, I am 60, my wife is 60, and we're adopting another little boy right now. We've had him since he was, it's and look, the birth mother is the same birth mother as our 7-year-old daughter, so so they're siblings, and he had his first couple months of life were pretty rough. But and I'm an adopted kid, and so are all my siblings. So some of it is hyper personal on that level. This may sound like an odd observation. I've been actually somewhat surprised that society has sort of dealt with the Dobbs decisions and those things, fairly well. You think of the hysteria at the time, and from when we do group discussions or other things, it rarely actually comes up. I think much of the politics, particularly in sort of my part of the country, has sort of moved on now to more economic issues.
And then going back to my second question, do you support even more restrictions, such as a nationwide abortion ban?
Well, no, but stop for a second. Remember, the whole point of the Dobbs decision was that it wasn't the federal government's place. That ultimately, no, but ultimately, the decision was that it was bad law made by the courts, and that it belonged at the state level. Now, those who have the joy of being state legislators or initiatives within those states will make these decisions.
Okay. Great. And so going towards the future and talking about your state specifically, we have seen a blue wave take over Arizona. We now have a Democrat in the governor's seat. So how do you think that Governor Katie Hobbs is doing, in your opinion? And do you think that we could attribute her win in 2022 to your state's rejection of right-wing ideals?
I think actually, if you really dive into the postmortem, which we have, you see a substantial movement of people moving their voter registration to independent. So they're annoyed with Democrats, they're annoyed with Republicans. They've actually become, you see the growth of independent registration. We're actually even looking at our congressional district, and probably by the end of the decade, being registered independent may be my number one registration, not Republican. And so where I think there's a failure in your question is, was it a blue wave, or was it a failure of particularly Republican candidates to actually focus on what voters cared about? And this often happens to us. We have things we care about passionately. We talk about those instead of taking a step backwards. My congressional district may be the highest inflation in the continental United States. As a matter of fact, it is the highest inflation in the continental United States. Maybe talking about and fixating on how you're going to help on the gas and groceries and just the ability to afford life, and your family and those things. So what happens when parties often become so focused on the issues they care about instead of the issues their voters care about? And in many ways, Democrats did a better job of talking about those stories than many of the Republicans did. But it's interesting. It's more complex because the voters are a lot smarter than the political class often gives them credit for. You can actually see sort of the splits. So the legislature stayed Republican, and some of the top offices were taken by the Democrats.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up people switching over to becoming independent. Someone pretty big just did that, Senator Kirsten Sinema. So what were your reactions when she announced that move?
I think it actually shows how calcified, in her case, how frustrated she was with much of the left's ideological rigidness. Remember, it wasn't that long ago, particularly like here in the House of Representatives, you had blue dog Democrats, you had the military security Democrats, you actually had, and I think even today, if you were actually to lay out even some of the Democrats who call themselves moderate, if you actually look at where they are ideologically, there's really only a handful that really qualify as being moderate Democrats. And that's the nature of, for many, the ability to survive the primaries. And I think Ms. Sinema sort of rejected some of that ideological rigidness.
And so, speaking of the Senate, I have to ask, are you planning on making a run against her?
Oh, heavens no.
Oh, okay. So you can confirm you're not going to place your bid for the Senate, but are
No,
you
no.
planning on running
I
for
would
re-election
actually
in the
like
House?
signing up for a 6-year job. I am married to a woman who we love Arizona, and in many ways we despise Washington, D.C. So,
And so, since you have officially declared that you're not running for the Senate, who do you feel like you'll throw your support behind? Could it be former GOP candidate Carrie Lake for governor?
no, we have to see who actually announces. It's still very, very early, and I'm not being critical, but this is one of my great sadnesses of modern news coverage. Is we spend so much time on the horse race aspect and not the policy aspects of government. And it's sort of who's up, who's down, and the election's a year and a half from now. I at least on the off year, could we actually at least fixate on policy?
Yeah, no, definitely appreciate that comment back. Well, is there anything else you would like to add in terms of policy that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet in our conversation?
Actually, what I did want to add is I appreciate you, and I appreciate you doing these. It's one of the few formats, some of us who really care a lot about policy ever get to talk a bit more in detail. So thank you for doing this.
Yes, of course. Well, our conversation could have been an hour and a half like it was last year, but I appreciate you answering all the questions in the limited amount of time we had today. So thank you so much for joining me, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.